The Beach Boys with Spirit of America. While that song is actually about driver Craig Breedlove's record-setting jet-propelled car called The Spirit of America, the Beach Boys may as well have been singing about themselves. After all, one of their nicknames is America's Band. That's also the title of a new and beautiful coffee table book about the Beach Boys. And its author, Johnny Morgan, joins us now to chat about this book. Johnny, being from the UK, you'll probably have a good perspective on this. I have always heard that the Beach Boys have always been far more popular in Great Britain than they've been in the U.S.
I think that probably is true. And they were certainly here a lot of the time through the 60s. And is there an irony here? Probably, because the Beatles were busy bringing back to you the music that in many ways Brian had done away with, but was also obsessed with.
Right.
That R&B sound that they were bringing back, remember, to you guys in 64, 65, only played with guitars. But they were over here, and the tours in the UK were amazing, and they had very many hits. They had more number one hits in England than they ever did in America.
Right.
It was Brits buying into the dream concept of the surfing, and they, but long after the Beatles had done away with the collarless suits, the Beach Boys were still here wearing the striped shirts and tight pants, and
right.
I think by the late 60s they were still doing Monster Mash, weren't they, on the latest live show in the UK, which is kind of, that's pre-Beatles. That's the interesting thing, is that they weren't a nostalgia act at this point here, but I think my sense is that they were a nostalgia act in America before they became one here.
Well, as the story goes, the Pet Sounds album went top 10 here in the U.S., but over in Great Britain, it was, this gigantic landmark album that everyone had to have. And in 1966, the NME voted the Beach Boys as the top group over the Beatles, which a lot of people in America still refuse to believe, but it's true.
The Beatles stopped touring in the UK pretty much by 64. Most of the people who ever saw the Beatles live in the UK did so in 63, when they had two tours, and people were paying very little money to go and see them in kind of 1,500 to 2,000-seater cinemas and show places, because Love Me Do was not a huge hit here when it came out in 62.
Right.
But She Loves You was, and I Want to Hold Your Hand definitely was. That was the first one that kicked off. But at the same time, the UK, there was so much going on that I think the Beatles it seems to me they had a far greater effect culturally in the States in many ways than they did in the UK.
Yes.
But I think that's also the kind of British attitude of, they're so over. As soon as they've made it, they're so over.
Right. I wonder, though, because the Beach Boys have such a California myth, to borrow a term from David Leaf, in Britain, that could only be a fantasy life. I mean, I suppose you could go to Brighton and try and live the surfing lifestyle, but I mean, it must have seemed like just a fantasy what Brian and the guys were singing about.
Yes, well, you see, the thing is that the whole rock and roll myth in the UK was, maybe you don't know, do you know what Teddy Boys were?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so Teddy Boys called that because they wore their Edwardian grandfathers' suits and overcoats, because their grandfathers generally had a very good suit that had been handmade because they were factory made in those days, and often their grandfathers had died in the First World War or whatever, and it was handed down to father and grandson. But they had them remodeled to look exactly like, do you remember a TV show called The Maverick?
Yes.
James Garner?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The whole Teddy Boy thing was to make it look like they were in a Western, to look like they were James Garner in Maverick. So that's why they put velvet on the collar. What's fascinating is how a man named Jack Good, who was English and a TV producer, managed to get Jerry Lee Lewis wearing that drape suit and that look, which suddenly became part of the rock and roll wardrobe. Indeed, it was Jack Good who put Gene Vincent into the leathers that another British rocker called Vince Taylor had worn first. And that was because Jack Good didn't think Gene Vincent was scary enough. He thought you need to look more scary. So rock and roll has been based on an American myth the myth of the West, the myth of the gambling gentleman, etc. And Teddy Boys, they had their hairstyle the way they did because of Tony Curtis. They called it a DA, which I will not go into here, or
Right.
a Tony Curtis haircut. And England, because of the war, because of austerity, because of suddenly movies were coming over that hadn't been shown for years. So by the mid-50s, England's youth were in love with America, and they had no idea of how to exist as a teenager, except from looking at American views of teenagers. It was being presented to them on the cinema screen. So Jimmy Dean was another big style icon here.
Right.
And Chuck Berry records were enormous here. And I don't actually know how big they were in the States, but the whole Chuck Berry driving and cars, the whole American lifestyle thing was huge. So when the Beach Boys came over, with not just the surf sound, but also the cars, that was really important. That whole rock and roll American dream that so many Brits who could really only dream about it because you couldn't get American cars onto British roads. They take up both lanes. It was very much a matter of, yes, this is the sound and the idea of a dream that people really wanted to believe in and wanted to be part of.
It sure has been a lot of fun the past week here in the good old British Isles, and the weather's great.
The Beach Boys live in London, 1968, right here on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. Our guest is Johnny Morgan. He's the author of, a lot of books on rock and roll, but today we're talking about the book, The Beach Boys, America's Band. As I said, it's a beautiful coffee table book, and one we'll be giving away in just a few short moments. But it's a wonderful overview of the group's career with plenty of photos and reprints of old magazine articles on the Beach Boys. If you were looking for a handsome coffee table book that covered the Beach Boys' career from the very beginning right up through 2015, you really can't get much better than this.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. That was the idea, and it's also a matter for people who were younger and who hadn't lived through it, but for whom the sound of the Beach Boys is still hugely appealing. And there's no doubt that those harmonies nobody does it better. But yes, the idea was to put them into context, and to that end, also though to dispel some myths, because of course the great thing is that the Beach Boys actually didn't surf. Well, you know what? I think Carl definitely was in love with the lifestyle. He might not have surfed that much, but Dennis would have done.
Right.
I love the fact that Brian used to be a jock at high school, right?
Yeah.
He was. That's again, people would not believe you if you said that to them, would they? You could say, Brian, wasn't he was a jock at high school? I go, no way. But he was, and I kind of figured that if he wasn't so obsessed with music, he may have been down there on the beach as well. But also, I think it's important to point out that when the Beach Boys came into the surf scene, particularly Dennis discovered it, they were outlaws. They genuinely were outlaws that they were watching and they were seeing on the surf scene out there in California. These are disaffected ex-GIs who were living on the beach because they had no home and living because they had a nihilistic view of life. And for them, the surf was the closest thing they could come to feeling alive as they felt in battle, maybe. That's really interesting, I think.
Johnny, there was a time in the late 60s when serious rock and roll fans dismissed the Beach Boys. And for some, they carry that with them right till the present day. But there's been a change over the years. The tide has turned, no pun intended, and now the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson are taken very seriously.
A lot of people seem to have reassessed the Beach Boys long after the fact. Which is why, to me, in the UK certainly, and I think this had a big effect on the way that the Beach Boys were regarded in America, was that when the New Musical Express in 1976, for some strange reason, when Britain was in the absolute grip of the punk scene, it had really taken over here. The Pistols,
right,
huge on every cover, the Clash, but the NME for the Christmas edition of 1976. For some reason, one looked back at the year 1966, and one of their albums of the year was Pet Sounds. Now, up to that point, my memory, and I was a punk at that time because I was 15, my memory is that the Beach Boys were always a pop band.
Right.
But this reevaluation of the album by the New Musical Express kind of began I think, a critical movement to reassess Brian's work and the Beach Boys' work. And a couple of years later, the NME ran their best albums of the world ever list. And for the first few years they ran it, Marvin Gaye's What's Going On was always the number one album. But then, in the early 80s, that was overtaken by Pet Sounds.
Right.
And every poll then suddenly, oh no, Pet Sounds is the best album ever made. Which is a kind of shift in critical appreciation of the past. But I think that's really important. But also the important thing about this 1976 NME thing was saying that you cannot now look at the Beach Boys story without considering the tragedy of Brian's life.
That's true. Years ago, in the early 70s, young people discovered the Beach Boys here in America with the Endless Summer compilation, which was all the pre-Pet Sounds material. And the legend of Brian Wilson and his struggle was something people really didn't get into all that much. That has changed. I mean, someone who's 23 right now who wants to find out about the Beach Boys, the first thing they're going to be directed towards if they go online is the Pet Sounds album or the unreleased Smile sessions. It's actually not going to be the early hits.
Yeah, that's where they start, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's almost like some fans have gone so far as to discount anything that came before it, which is a real switch from how it used to be critically. That is not when Brian performs live or when Mike and Bruce perform live. They're playing those early hits. The set list is filled with those songs because that's what the average person going to a show wants to hear. But I always think of those early albums, Surfin' Safari, Surfin' USA, All Summer Long, all those albums up through Pet Sounds as being part of one piece. I don't think anything is more beautiful. I think Don't Worry Baby is as good as anything on Pet Sounds. It's just different.
I would agree with you, absolutely. And if anything, there are filler tracks. That's undoubtedly true.
Right.
But Brian, what he always wanted to do was to better Phil Spector. That has been his life's career, as far as I can see.
We're talking with Johnny Morgan, author of the book The Beach Boys, America's Band. Johnny, your book sort of breezes through the 80s, 90s, and double O's in the Beach Boys' career, and I know that there are some hardcore Beach Boys fans who are desperate to get a whole book just on that era and all the intrigue. But in terms of musical activity, apart from live shows, really not that much. I mean, with the exception of Brian's solo career, it's all just one big victory lap.
I think, but the problem is with that Ghosty, I think actually there were so many court cases that they were throwing at each other. And it's kind of like this really is looking at, because it's not about music anymore. It's
right.
It's about harmony. It's completely about disharmony. And yes, I could have filled the book twice as long. Publishers didn't want me to, with stories about, and there are a lot of kind of things, fictional ideas about what Mike did to Brian and what Brian did to Mike,
right.
And much of which we will. What's interesting is they've always been very, very honest and lived their lives in the open, but you'll never get to the bottom of it. And really, do you want to? Because all you're doing, Mike, yes, absolutely continued with that victory lap, and he had to bring in other musicians. I love the fact, of course, that sons of original members turn up again, and they bring back original members, and that's great, because it really is. It feels like, in some ways, a kind of touring circus, doesn't it? It's kind of the old circus performers who would introduce the family into it, which is great. But most of it, awfully, it involves a lot of kind of wrangling over the name and attempts to do stuff in the economic area, which has actually got nothing to do with the music and the Beach Boys music, but all to do with turning the legend into something which is going to make money and more money. And that's the way of the world also at the same time. But there's also, I think, there's another turning point in the way that America regarded the Beach Boys with Ronald Reagan, which is really interesting. When you look at the July 4th concert in 1980, that they played, and they played Reagan's inauguration party. Of course, remember, this is the same Ronald Reagan who'd been governor of California when in 1971, when... was that the Beach Boys who put out some song about the California and
Yes.
when I've forgotten the name of the silly man who actually then claimed that he'll never have the Beach Boys and they're like back at the July 4th party.
James Watt. Yeah.
That's it, James Watt, yeah. I didn't want to remember his name. So, and then the great American public went, how dare you?
Right.
And at that point, and that was when this whole idea of them being called America's Band came into being. I think it was Ronnie, it might have been Ronnie Reagan, who actually came out with, or his speechwriters, forgive me, he came up with this idea of calling them They Are America's Band. And of course, Mike has clung to it. And as I say in the book, at some point he did actually try to trademark it, that phrase, to the Beach Boys. Judges just said, you can't, this is impossible, you cannot trademark America's Band. You just can't do that. So he didn't get it. But you can understand it.
Right.
Legacy acts, they need to monetize as far as they can. And given the terrible returns from streaming, who can blame them?
Now, if people want to get the book or catch up with what you're doing, where would they go online to do that?
Well, obviously, if you use Amazon, obviously there's a Johnny Morgan page. But my Facebook page, there's Johnny Morgan. I did have a blog, but I just haven't had the time to write it for now. But no, mostly probably the Facebook page. There's an Amazon with my name attached. There is somebody else called Johnny Morgan out there writing books. Apparently, I think on a couple of soccer books. That's nothing to do with me. But yeah. But there's a book on the history of disco, which I'm very proud of, a couple of. In fact, at the moment, I've just today been asked to update another one of my album covers, greatest album covers of all time. So should be updating that and adding some new ones to recent ones.
Well, thanks so much, Johnny. It's been a great discussion. Once again, the book is The Beach Boys, America's Band, by our guest today, Johnny Morgan, and we'll be giving that book out right now. At the beginning of this interview, we played the song The Spirit of America, and I said the Beach Boys may as well have been singing about themselves with that song. Well, here they really are singing about themselves. This is Endless Harmony.